Ed here with the Digital Digest, and today I wanted to share yet another update on my experience with the Asus Zephyrus G15. So for those of you that have followed my rolling updates on this machine, there have been a lot because, well, this machine is bleeding edge, is not perfect like basically every other laptop or piece of electronics out there, but still incredibly good, and it's made my decision in terms of which machine, this or the Aero 15, would be my next daily driver, a very difficult decision. But I have come to a conclusion, and the G15 is the winner. Now, I know many of you were certain I was going to go with the Aero. In fact, in both my first comparison to the Aero KC, as well as the second comparison to the XC model, I was still leaning towards the Gigabyte, and for a variety of very good reasons. Unfortunately, some of those reasons ended up undoing my love affair with the Aero 15 and brought me back to the G15. So, first of all, the G15 still rules the landscape when it comes to price to performance ratio. In fact, this Best Buy model of the G15, for those of you unfamiliar, that sports the AMD Ryzen 9 5900HS along with the NVIDIA RTX 3070, actually went down in price to $1,750. So that made it $50 even more attractive in terms of what you're getting with that CPU-GPU combo. And of course, the 15.6-inch QHD 165Hz color-accurate IPS panel that it sports. So that's number one. That $50 price drop, I'm not sure why they did it for a few days, but they did. And I was able to do a price match and get that $50 back. And while $50 doesn't make my decision, it certainly influences it. And the fact that the Aero 15 XC, which is $2,200, now $2,250, depending on who you go to, is really only a little bit ahead of this machine in terms of performance. Of course, it has Thunderbolt 3, which I will greatly miss. It's not quite fully functioning Thunderbolt 3 in that it doesn't permit Trickle Charge. When being used with a dock, it cannot be woken up with the dock. Those are things that are deal breakers for me, and that pretty much leaves me in a very similar situation to not having it at all. So here we are with the G15. Also, when it comes to its weight to actual performance ratio, still unmatched. Remember, this is a 4.2-pound laptop, and its power brick isn't that big either. Capable of quick charge, capable of trickle charge over the Type-C port that's right over here, the two of them that also double as your display port 1.4 ports. That's a big deal. I mean, 4.2 pounds with the brick, you're looking at 4.5. That does make this actually substantially lighter than the majority of the competition. Now, the Aero isn't that much heavier, but I can tell you that side by side, using them for roughly a month each, if you followed my coverage, it did start to wear on me, and I don't have a problem, don't need to hit the gym. It's just a matter of, would you like your machine to be heavier or not? Now, I did prefer the Aero in terms of overall build quality, but I have to point out that this did seem to just feel generally like a much lighter machine without sacrificing build quality too much. Now, it is predominantly made of plastic, but it still is solid, no creaks. It doesn't mean it's free of QC problems. The speaker issue with drivers has gotten much better, almost to the point that it's not on my radar anymore. Now, the difference when it comes to an IPS high refresh rate QHD panel to a 4K OLED, of course it's night and day. But I will say this in favor of the G15. It was yet another thing that influenced me. Once you have basically gotten accustomed to high refresh rates on all of your displays, which I have, and we're talking about phones, tablets, PC monitors, it's tough to really go back to 60 Hertz, even if it's an OLED and is UHD, which is my desired resolution. I would much rather have a 4K panel in this laptop than QHD, but I would say, meeting or overlapping of the best of both worlds, which is slightly more than full HD, along with 165 Hertz, does make this a special experience. So, and the fact that it is color accurate means that I didn't have to sacrifice that much. Yes, there's a world of difference between IPS panels and OLED panels, but I do find that this strikes the best balance currently available. Now, that does not mean I wouldn't have been happy with the 4K OLED. In fact, I still would have preferred it in many ways, but I have to say, if and when I need to do any gaming, even things as simple as browsing the web, I enjoy having the higher refresh rate. We don't have 4K OLED panels yet in this form factor with higher refresh than 60 Hertz, but hopefully sometime this year or beginning of next, which I think is more realistic, we probably will then see high refresh OLED panels in laptops. And when that comes around, well, that'll be the death of IPS. This will really become budget only, which is the direction IPS has gone over the last decade, if you follow it. They're still expensive panels, but every year they get cheaper and cheaper. And now, I mean, IPS panels are dirt cheap. So that's why QHD 165 Hertz and color accurate ones are where manufacturers like Asus had to go in order to still make them really attractive to a general audience as well as content creators and gamers like myself. Another thing beyond that is, the keyboard and trackpad. Now, the Aero 15, the keyboard and trackpad were fine. They were not bad. I preferred the fact that we had a numerical keypad here. We don't have a print screen button here either. But I will say this, the keyboard experience is definitely better on the G15 than the Aero. And, whether or not that's going to influence your decision, at the end of the day, I think you are going to judge a laptop by the sum of its parts. And on paper, I do think the Aero is the better machine. But again, with everything I've mentioned, then coupling in the fact that the keyboard experience here is better, the keys have a little bit more travel, the backlighting is RGB, but not RGB per key like the Aero. But again, just typing, my general workflow, emails, browsing the web, this is the better keyboard. Then throw into the fact that it also has the better touchpad. The trackpad here is not light years better, but much better and larger. So it's not, I shouldn't say much better, but larger, which means that when I'm doing things that would normally require a mouse, it's easier for me to handle with a trackpad that's this large than the one on the Aero. And it doesn't help that on the Aero, the fingerprint scanner is located right here, so it actually eats up part of that smaller trackpad. Now, the fingerprint scanner here is on the power button, but I don't really rely on fingerprint readers, so it's not a big deal. Of course, still not in love with the fact that we have no webcam, still not in love with the fact that you can visually see all of the LED notifications while you're using the laptop. These were not great design cues, in my opinion. And I'm still a little bit worried. A lot of people have talked about the ventilation causing the bezel, the chin, to warp. I'm actually more concerned just about dust getting inside of this display, because over the course of my use, I've noticed that dust is accumulating, and then as careful as I try to be, it will often go inside the bezel. Now, if that gets behind the screen, it's going to be a nightmare. So just something to be aware of. It doesn't make me have extreme confidence about it, but in spite of what I've mentioned with quality control, when my relationship with this machine began, there were issues like blue screens of death, BSOD, as well as just instability. And the reason that this also was able to seal the deal is those problems went away. So it was a matter of software updates, firmware, until things got solid, and I have not seen any more instability as far as using it as a PC. Let's also not forget it does have better battery life than the Aero. So while I didn't think those things would influence me enough to make the G15 my ultimate choice, and they haven't, the fact that the G15 came up short is really, the Aero 15 came up short on a few critical things, like Thunderbolt, which is something missing from here, like its HDMI 2.1 output not being fully fleshed out. And if you missed the comparison, again, I just mentioned it earlier in this video, even though this machine does not have Thunderbolt 3, and I am invested in Thunderbolt 3 docks as well as external NVMe drives, the fact of the matter is that the Thunderbolt 3 port on the Aero, as I mentioned, does not support trickle charging, which I could have lived without. But more importantly, that means if you're connected to a dock and you have this closed up, again, I'm talking about the Aero, not the G15, and you want to use it basically as a desktop, in a vertical stand, which is what I was doing, and that's also what I do with this machine. There was no way to wake up the machine without actually taking it out of the vertical stand, opening it up, and hitting the power button or keys in order to wake it up. And while many of you will say, oh, you could have just left it in a rainfall stand, you're nitpicking, that's not how I plan to use it. It's that simple. And I did not, I wasn't aware that Gigabyte had gone the route of basically nerfing the Thunderbolt 3 port. Here, no Thunderbolt 3, so that's a non-issue. The good news is that I can wake this machine up while it's closed up, and it can also be charged through the Thunderbolt ports. So if essentially what it comes down to is that while I cannot use a Thunderbolt dock, of course I can still use a regular Type-C dock, and that will serve, you know, most of my needs. And the point is that the convenience of Thunderbolt was lost on the Aero, even though we still had the performance, which is critical to me. Both of these Type-C ports still maintain close to 800 megabytes a second, which, while that's about 65 to 75% of peak speed I'll get out of Thunderbolt 3, because I do pull anywhere from 1.25 gigs a second all the way up to possibly 1.5. I still have to say that once you lose the convenience and novelty of having Thunderbolt as that single umbilical, even if you're going to still keep power hooked up, it's a big loss. So it also doesn't hurt, as I mentioned, that Trickle Charge is here, which it does not exist. And that's another thing that keeps this machine light. It means that if you're traveling and you don't need to put it into its turbo mode, right now I actually have it on iGPU mode, which I'm also going to touch on, then, and it's in silent. If you know that the most you're ever going to do is put it up to performance, which is still solid, you can still game here, you can still video and photo edit, no problem. You just can't get full throttle on this thing. Then obviously, if and when it's safe to travel, because I don't recommend it still here in the pandemic, but when the time comes, then you know you don't really have to bring the proprietary brick. You could just bring a 100-watt wall adapter and just plug it in, and that's that, which is literally just about no weight compared to the proprietary brick. Now, I'm not saying I would do that, but for road warriors, this is going to matter, because this machine, really, the beauty of it is it's a gaming laptop through and through, but outside of its looks, which again, I mentioned them time and time again, it's not the most beautiful, it's also not the most ugly machine. It really can fool you into thinking you're not working on a gaming machine because of how quiet it is. And then with iGPU mode on, battery life is pretty damn good. So these are things that make me feel like I'm not working on a gaming laptop, even though I am. And that was another thing that swayed my decision. So again, to recap, the price to performance really can't be beat, especially if you do scoop it at $1750 or an open box price. I really do think that if you don't have a 4K OLED, this is the next best thing. And anyone who has followed my channel over the years, and I've been on YouTube now for nearly a decade, if not just about, I have always been OLED centric. There is never a time you will hear me say, I'll take an IPS or any panel for that matter, going back to plasma days over the OLED option. OLED has always been the future. It is the present. It's taken too long, frankly, but it's here and it's within reach. It's finally also not going to break the bank. I mean, the fact that you can get the Aero 15 in the KC variety for $1,600 and get a 4K OLED and all of the hardware is just crazy. You wouldn't think that's possible. I mean, all of a few years ago, the only OLEDs you could find were in Alienware laptops for over $2,000. So we've come a long way. But at the end of the day, again, the resolution, refresh rate, and color accuracy, plus just what ended up being the sum of the parts of the G15 at $1,750 pre-tax US dollars, impossible to really beat. And I do care about pricing. I certainly can afford the other machine, but pricing is relevant because these things are inherently obsolete. The moment you get them into your hands, depreciation is upon you. The value of these things, if you're thinking about selling them down the road, you're going to get screwed. I mean, that's just the case with all laptops, but especially the ones that are really expensive. If you follow pricing on any computer components outside of GPUs these days, within 1 year, monitors are another exception if you get something really top-notch. Within 1 year, the depreciation is 50%. It just always is. My HP Spectre from 2019 is a great example. Got that at the end of 2019. And by 2020, the refresh that hit that I've covered, it was $500 less for the same specifications. Forget what the resale value of my laptop is. That was in part due to the fact that Intel and AMD are finally competing, which is absolutely celebration worthy. And that is what this product ends up being a derivative of, is that because we finally have competition, you get a brand new CPU that at 35 watts is really tough to beat. And by the way, with the latest NVIDIA Game Ready driver, which I think was on the 16th of this month, at least synthetic benchmarking went back up through the roof. So I was pulling, back, I would say on 3D Mark about 9,400 and change, which is just bonkers for a machine that weighs this much. And again, that stays this quiet. And then the look of it, the aesthetic, which I've never been in love with, and again, if you've been following, you know that, I'm going to get a remake, get a little bit of a makeover. I'm going to get a skin, going to actually look at a few skins from a manufacturer, so stay tuned for that, if that is of interest to you. Not sure exactly the ETA, but hopefully that'll be soon. And then that'll be a really simple way to essentially eliminate this look, which I am not a fan of. It's not the end of the world, but all these little holes are just another way for dust to get inside of this body. And then when it comes to upgrading, that's another thing to stay tuned for, besides my full review, which will come soon as well. The drives that you may have recently seen that I put inside of the Gigabyte Aero, those are going to make their way now into this guy right here. Now, I'm not sure if I'm going to use both of them, or I may just use one. I haven't decided yet. I may use them both. We'll see. But either way, again, for anyone who's wondering, Sabrent, the Rocket Q 4 terabyte, the Rocket 4 Plus 2 terabyte. Now, this is a next-gen NVMe, which future-proofs me so that if I ever want to just pop this out and drop it in a desktop or laptop that does support Type or Gen 4 PCI Express NVMe drives, I can do that. And then that's all going to be done on the heels of the Sabrent cloning dual NVMe drive that I covered in the past. This is a great accessory. I'm going to include links to all of these because this is my upgrade path for this. It's really going to turn this into a workstation. And that's the crazy thing about 2021 is that we have laptops that emulate workstation performance that are, a little over 4 pounds that really I don't think we saw coming. And even if you were always dreaming about them, they didn't exist. And I'll also include a link for one of these little guys, the Ifixit Toolkits, because you're going to need it. In general, it's good to have when you're doing work like this and upgrading anything, frankly, whether it's laptops, you got to work on a cell phone, a tablet. It's just good to have, and they're not expensive. Of course, there are cheaper China tool kits that you can get through Amazon, but this one has served me well, so I can recommend it. But that pretty much sums things up. Again, the G15 is my choice. So for those of you that thought it was in the bag for the Aero, think again. I have decided to give Asus, even with the soldered RAM, the 8 gigs that I harped on oh so much, I have decided to give Asus a shot. It's been a real long time since I've had an Asus laptop. I do, as I've mentioned, still have plenty of Asus components. In fact, my desktop, I've got an Asus motherboard. I have 2 fantastic Asus monitors, but this is the first time in a long time that I will be rocking an Asus computer. And the full review will be coming, as well as I mentioned, the drive installation process. For those of you that are wondering, shouldn't be complicated. This does support 2 NVMe drives, so again, I've got to decide if I want to make it a 6 gig system, or maybe just use the 2 terabyte or just the 4 terabyte and leave the other one that came with this as a storage drive in addition. We'll see. I'll figure it out. But stay tuned for that, as well as my full review, and we've got more good stuff in the pipeline. Just got in a HP Omen rocking a 3090. That's a desktop, of course, which I will be reviewing. Some insane benchmarks there, roughly 18,000 in 3D Mark. Yeah, we're in the 1 percentile of computing. So pretty amazing stuff, but stay tuned. Any questions or comments, please feel free to post them. Hit that like button, and as usual, please feel free to subscribe, and please stay safe. Later.